In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. O heavenly King, O Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasure of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us. Cleanse us from every stain and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen.
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 Well, welcome everybody. We're so glad you're here with us for OCF at Home. I know this is an interesting, maybe exciting opportunity for you all to connect with each other. I'm Christina Andreessen. I'm the Director of Ministries for OCF. But tonight, I'm really just your technology guru. So I'm going to kind of give you some tips and pointers if you haven't been on a Zoom webinar before about how this is going to work. And then I'm going to hand it off to Father Michael and Andrew. So it seems like you guys have already all figured out the chat. You can talk to each other in the chat at any time. If at some point you want to ask a question, which you'd like to keep it anonymous, you can use the Q&A, and I'll be moderating those questions and pitching them to Father Michael and Andrew at the right time. There's also going to be a couple of opportunities for you to be part of the discussion. So when Father Michael asks a question and says, "What do you all think?" You're going to want to hit the button at the bottom that says, "Raise your hand." And if you raise your hand, I can pull you up on the screen so that you can be part of the live discussion. If you get confused, feel free to put a question in the Q&A just for me about the technology stuff, and I will try to answer it for you directly. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew, our current Great Lakes student leader and chairman-elect for the Student Leadership Board for 2020-2021. And he's going to give a little bit of OCF announcements and then get into Father Michael's discussion.
Hey guys, I'm Andrew. As I'm sure you all are aware, we have also been bogged down by everything that's going on, but we will not be held down. So even though we did have to cancel a lot of regional and district events, we are shifting our focus to online programming for OCF. We're really excited. I'm mostly excited just now that I have something to do, now that I don't have a retreat that I can lead. So a couple things we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing these kind of meeting things every night. They serve two purposes here. One, kind of get everyone in contact with each other, bring us all together in that community that we don't have now that we're at campus. And for those of you who are kind of forming new chapters or don't have a chapter at your school, we're trying to show you what a good chapter meeting can look like, what the potential is for that. You could have yes, we will be doing this every Thursday night. But just, if you bring in a speaker and you're trying to open that dialogue with them, just different ways you can do that. We'll have a lot of different people on here, so we're really excited about that. We will also be, for those of you, a lot of you probably your churches are not letting you go to church. So I know a lot of churches are moving to live streams on Facebook, but we will also be doing a live stream chapel service every Sunday night, I believe at 8 Eastern, Christina. And so each Sunday night, we're going to be doing small comp line and then the Akathist of Thanksgiving or Akathist to the Theotokos, I don't know, one of those. So that'll be happening every Sunday night. So Sunday night, chapel, Thursday night, meeting, and then also stay connected with our social media, because since we don't have as much things happening on the ground, we're going to be really pushing some cool stuff out through that. One thing in particular, I'm sure you guys have all heard about our Lenten cookbook, but now we're bringing it to life. So we were actually making some videos of the different recipes. So just a little fun way to get involved with your favorite OCF influencers. And then what's our last thing? Oh, Student Leadership Board applications. Please, please, please apply. We have not had a lot of applications and I'm getting nervous and Christina's getting nervous. So everything's going to be fine. You just need to apply. So those applications do close on Sunday, March 29th. So right before you go to chapel this Sunday, a week from then, submit your application, so we don't get a bunch of applications on the last day. I believe that is all I have. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, and he can definitely do a better job of introducing himself than I can, but Father Michael Nasser. He is from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And yes, Father, please introduce yourself because I can't do this.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Hello, everybody. I am Father Michael Nasser. I'm the pastor here at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church, Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is sort of the west side of Michigan. It's directly across from Detroit. We are, so that's right. Hold on. That's us. Detroit's here. We're over here.
I've always wanted to do that.
What's that?
Use the hand thing. I've always wanted to do that.
Is that fun?
Yeah.
You do Pennsylvania too. Pennsylvania, but Michigan works. Anyway, I've been here for almost 5 years now. Before here, I was at the Holy Apostles Mission in Bowling Green, Kentucky for 5 years. Before that, I was blessed to be the chaplain at St. Innocent Orphanage in Project Mexico. And before that, 10 years as the camp director at Antiochian Village. And before that, I was a parish priest for a couple years at St. George in New Kensington. So I've dragged my family all over North America, and they love me for it. They might be watching this right now, so they might chime in and say, not really, but anyway. So yeah, did a lot of wonderful things and very blessed to be in great places and meet a lot of people, some of which I think are on now. So hi to Rami Q, because he'll be the most excited of anybody that I'll call out by name. Anyway, glad to be with you all. I've been involved with OCF for a long, long time. Someday I'll tell you the story I told these two about the connection between the founding of OCF and the filming of National Treasure, but we'll see if we have time at the end. What we're going to talk about tonight, I think it's going to be the theme every Thursday during these chats for a while. We're going to look at one of Father Thomas Hopko's 55 Maxims for Christian Living. If you haven't seen them before, Google it, look at the list. Print it out, put it up somewhere, because what these are Father Hopko tried to just sort of sum up what are the kind of basics. It sounds like a lot, 55. It's a lot more than the 10 Commandments, a lot more than Jesus' 2 commandments, but they're pretty specific. And they're really, a lot of them are things that we really think are important, that we might have missed them. So it's a really great list. We're going to look at one of those every week. What I want to say about them is they're great. They're great at sort of how to live your Christian life day in and day out. I know right now we all have coronavirus on the brain. We're not going to talk about it for a little bit. We're going to take like a half hour, 45-minute break. So that's probably the last. Hopefully I'm going to mention it. If you want to stay on after we're done, we may, for those that want to stick around and talk a little bit about how you're doing, we can do that. But we're going to take a break from it. But I wanted to say it now is that when we look at these maxims, they're really appropriate for no matter what situation we're in. They help you live your life as an Orthodox Christian, whether you are my age and you've got a family, or whether you're a college student, or anywhere in between, or older or younger. And the fact that they're maxims, I think, is interesting, that we're talking about, we're not talking about requirements, we're not talking about commandments. They're maxims, which is, if you think about it, like something to shoot for. And that's what I love. One of the things I love about Orthodoxy is we don't check off boxes of minimums. We have maxims. We have things that are like, this is the ideal. And this is what we want to shoot for. So I think that's great, that the fact of the maxims, and they're for Christian living. It's not about Christian believing. A lot of us sometimes get in the idea of our Christian life is what we hold to be true. It's really about what we put who we put our trust in, and what we do about that. So even in the title, 55 Maxims for Christian Living, there's a lot I think we can learn out of that. A lot of them, and I'm going to read really quickly the first 7, they're kind of obvious why they're there and why they made the list. Tonight's, I don't think, is quite as obvious, but I want to just read a couple of these so you can get an idea of what they're like if you're not familiar with them. Number 1 is be always with Christ and trust God in everything. Number 2, pray as you can, not as you think you must. 3, have a keepable rule of prayer done by discipline. 4, say the Lord's Prayer several times each day. And I'm not going to say the word, but by the way, while you're washing your hands, it's a great way to time washing your hands. If you wash your hands while you're saying the Lord's Prayer, it's a great way to hit just around 20 seconds. But anyway, and do it several times a day. Maxim number 5, repeat a short prayer when your mind is not occupied. Number 6, make some prostrations when you pray. Number 7, eat good foods in moderation and fast on fasting days. So you kind of see they're really specific. It's not just very general topics. They're specific. They're things that we could actually think, am I doing this? Am I doing this today? Am I doing this in general? So in all of them, I think really kind of, you kind of see why he would put them on a list of all the things that we should do. Tonight's is actually, we're jumping down to number 43, if you look at the list. And that's one that I think isn't quite as obvious. Why would be a maxim for Christian living? And even sometimes, some ways you might think, gee, that sounds kind of wrong. So tonight we're going to look at, don't try to convince anyone of anything. Don't try to convince anyone of anything. And we'll get to why it's actually a maxim for Christian living. But first, let's look at why that might not be so obvious. I mean, I think there are probably a lot of good things that we would want to convince people of, right? So this is audience participation time. What are some of the things that you think would be good to convince people of?
Time to raise your hand, everybody. Can't wait to call on you. Yes, let me find who just raised their hand. Oh, why is this hard to find? There it is. All right, let's bring up David. Maybe. Oh, and then Caroline, you're next. David, you have to unmute yourself. There we go. David.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes?
we can hear you.
Oh, okay.
What are some things you want to convince people of?
I mean, since we are talking about an OCF event meeting, I'm sure that convincing people about Orthodoxy, I mean, that's pretty, obvious, I guess.
Yeah, it would seem like that's an obviously good thing to do. We should try to convince people to see the goodness in Orthodoxy. Great example. What other good examples are there?
Caroline. And by Caroline, we mean Thomas. Thomas.
I didn't want to be added. But can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Maybe like to not hurt yourself or like something like that. It's like
Right.
somebody is sad.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You'd want to convince them. Seems obvious, right? Like that's a good thing to do. And how challenging is going to be that by the time we're done, to really understand that we shouldn't convince anyone of anything. And you take that example, it's like, wow, that sounds a little wrong.
Yeah, I feel like there's some things that could be like, like kind of like an asterisk there. But
Yeah. And we're going to find out if by the end, we're going to find out if the asterisk belongs there or not.
Matt, welcome from Canada. What did you have, Matt?
Hey guys.
Ooh, kind of.
So Father Michael, you mentioned about the little asterisk there. My question is convincing someone about absolute truth, that there is actually a truth that's not relative, and that truth is Christ. And that's something that I think that I should actually be trying to convince people of.
Right. I mean, because we're one of the few people left in the world that really think there is something that is true and not in a relative sense. So you would think, isn't that our job to convince them? All right. Great examples. Anybody else want to jump in, or is everybody
Some
ready?
people from the chat said, convincing people to apply for the SLB. I like that one.
Exactly. Good example.
Call me out, why don't you?
Convincing ourselves that we're no better than others, and then be convinced if you don't believe it. Somebody else said, is it related to being humble, since convincing is something that starts from us and not from Christ?
Oh, Julian, don't jump ahead too far. All right. Yeah, great. All good examples of things that you would think like somebody is not being healthy. Like, hey, why don't you come with me? We're going to go to the gym. Good thing. Convince somebody to get some exercise. Maybe somebody's in a bad relationship and you see like being with that other person is like no good. So what do? Out of being caring and loving, at least we think, we try to convince them, right? And I wanted to start there because I think if we don't understand how good it seems to convince people of things, we're not going to understand why when he says, don't try to convince anyone of anything. Before we get there, though, I want to ask one more question. Why do we try? Why do we try to convince people of things?
Raise your hands. I like to see your faces.
Raise your hands. Wasn't that a song? I was recently, I guess. Before your time, people.
No? Why do we try to do it?
Any ideas? I will call on somebody.
Oh, we got some. Here we go. Patrick is coming, and Marcus and Catherine. They're all on their way.
All right.
There's Patrick. Patrick, you can turn on your video.
Oh,
Catherine, you too.
Hi.
hi.
Patrick?
Wait. No, that's not what I wanted.
Patrick, go ahead. Answer the question.
So why do we try to convince people?
Yeah, what motivates us to do that?
Maybe because it's of great importance to us and we see it to be right.
Yeah. Good motivation.
Oh, that's
Right?
good. Oh man, is this the things around me?
Welcome. You're live.
If we feel we're in the right, or if we feel we want people to believe or think that the way that we do, I think that we can kind of try to convince others to kind of join that wavelength, so to say.
Yep.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Marcus.
I think just to go off what the other two people were saying, because we think that we're right, or we want to be right. We want to be the person to help other people. We want to be the person to convince other people that we're right about something.
Yeah. So sometimes let's look at maybe the less valid reasons. We might want to be right. We, out of some kind of arrogance or assurance that we are right, we want to be the one to convince someone else. So that's good. But I heard some really what seemed like valid reasons to try to convince someone. Someone else had an answer. Go ahead.
Bianca.
So I personally think that it's sometimes hard to accept what another person thinks if it's differing from your own personal views.
Yeah. Okay. So we want to convince, we want to correct, right? You hear wrong ideas or you hear ideas that people think are right. And so, especially if those ideas can be like dangerous or hurtful to people.
Mm-hmm.
All right. There's a lot of like political disunity in the country. I don't think it's people are mean. It's because they believe what they believe.
Yeah.
They think they have what's right for the whole country, and they think the other group doesn't. And so it's this kind of battle because I've got something that I want to do. Both sides, left and right, for their own view, think they're doing what they're doing against the other because they've got something that's important. All right. So a lot of great motivations. You have something of value you want to share with somebody. Somebody needs something that you want to share, information or guidance or something, and you care. So we're really building up a case for why this might be a terrible thing to have as a Christian maxim. Don't try to convince anyone anything, and yet we're saying you might have something really valuable. Out of care for the person, you want to share it, and they need it.
Does anybody want to add anything before I send you back to the ether? Okay.
Off they go.
Thanks.
All right, so here's the $1 million question. How can it be wrong? How can it be wrong if you have something good, your motivation to share it is good, and the person has need of it? How could that be wrong? And I'm going to sum it up in one way by saying, on one hand, it's none of our business. Now, when I say it's none of our business, I don't mean that our job is to only care for ourselves, and that's all we should be focused about, just caring for ourselves. Kathy, you want to say something?
No, I'm wondering why I'm still on with the panelists.
It's okay. Zoom is taking its time. Don't worry, you're okay.
It's okay.
So yeah, that's one way of looking at it, is just it's really none of our business. And when I say that, here's what I mean. There are two things I think that are our business. One is not necessarily convincing, but like you convincing, being responsible for ourselves. That's the first thing I want to say, is that, think about the phrase of, before you take the log out of someone else's eye, you take the speck out of your own. Being responsible for ourselves, not out of a selfishness, but to say that my job, number one, is to make sure I'm doing the thing that I need to do for myself. I shouldn't be looking at other people when I have things to do for myself. And the second part, and this is where I think we can all start to see why this is actually a really good thing. There's a difference between what we want someone to take from us, whether or not they want it, and what we have to share with somebody. And it's such a subtle point, but that's why I think this really is an important maxim, that we don't try to convince anyone of anything, because to convince somebody of something really says that we are taking responsibility for what they do. Okay? If I have something I want to offer you, if I want to give you something and I offer it to you as a gift, do I make you take it? No. I offer it. I hope you receive it because it's for you. It's done out of concern for you. It's from me. I think it's good for you to have, but I offer it as a gift. If I try to say, well, because it's good and because my motivation's good and because you need it, I'm going to do what I can that you take it. That's what I'm saying. Now we're gone out of minding our own business and we're taking over somebody else. In other words, we've moved from giving, caring, into the beginnings of control. You might say, well, Father Michael, if I'm trying to convince someone, I'm still letting them decide. Yeah, almost. Because if you're convincing, what's your goal? Your goal is to convince. Your goal is to change their mind, not to offer them the choice. Once you accept, I think word convince is so important. Once you get into convince, now my job is to argue with you, change your mind, influence you, and all the rest. I want to, in a sense, control. Now, I want to control everything. I want you to choose it. But the fact that I want you to choose it and I want to influence you, convince you to choose it, I'm starting to edge into your control. And that's why I think it's something that is not a good thing to do. I know some of you have a lot of thoughts probably. Let me say a couple things and we'll open it up here. Think about the example of Jesus Christ. Talk about the criteria of what we think is good. Somebody who has something good to give, obviously he did. Somebody who's motivated with the right motivations, absolutely, he's purely motivated by pure love. And then thirdly, we need it. So if there was ever anybody who was set up to convince someone of something, it would be Jesus Christ. And yet, look at what he does. Most of the time he taught parables. Rarely talked straight. Sometimes with the apostles would give some sort of straight teaching. Even with them, a lot of parables. Let me tell you a story. In other words, I'm going to tell you a story. I may or may not tell you what the story means, but I'm not going to come at you head on. I'm going to offer you something, and you're going to take it if you want or not. Think another example. Think how often he healed someone and then said, don't tell anybody. If Jesus wanted to convince, he would have said, go tell the whole world. Go tell everybody and go and convince everyone else. Two more examples I'll give you. Think about Christ as we're getting closer and closer to Holy Week. He's brought before Pilate. He's brought before the high priest. He's brought before Herod. In every case, says the least amount he can. They're all surprised by the same thing, his silence. Okay? So I just think that example of Christ should be powerful. And one more I'll give you is this. I think, obviously, the most powerful thing Christ ever did was to go to the cross out of his love for us. Very few words said, none preaching to the world, but by his example giving us, I think, the strongest statement he could make and offer freely for us to see the love of God, but there's no attempt at convincing. In fact, if you read the gospel narratives, people want him to convince. If you're the Son of God, take yourself down. In other words, convince us. And every time he refuses to be convinced. So anyway, I know it's a really different way of thinking about what we think are good motivations. But what do you think about that? I threw out a kind of a big twist on it. What do you all think?
Constantine and Ben already have thoughts. I can tell.
Somebody unmute and go for it.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Constantine, and thank you for the gathering everybody together. My own personal experiences with what you're trying to describe is been challenging, mostly because, like you said, we kind of transplant our own thoughts and ideas onto other people, and in most cases, it's very uninviting and kind of like, I can't find the right word for it, but it's very invasive. The saying is like you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so listen twice as much as you can speak.
Yeah.
Something along those lines, where it means a lot more to listen to what other people are saying rather than to try to channel whatever message you're trying to relate to them. And mostly people want to kind of be understood. So from my own perspective in trying to convince other people, it's not even trying to convince them, but just trying to see where their thought process is and for them to explain it. And they'll have their own come to Jesus moment, so to speak. And mostly their own journey is, like you said, being with others and helping guide their journey.
Yeah. There's 2 concepts I'll throw out. One comes from education, one comes from psychology. There's an idea in education that says all learning is self-learning. And that sounds kind of crazy that you can't teach someone else when people are teachers. That's what they do. Okay? But if you think about it, think about anything you've ever learned. And if you slow down that process, if you do it in slow motion, what you realize is that somebody threw out an idea, could be a concept, could be a belief, whatever. You looked at it, you sort of encountered it, and then you decided, I'm taking it in or I'm not. And this is really much easier to see in the realm of argument. It's hard to see in teaching. It's a little harder to see in teaching. You got to really slow it down. But the idea is, we're all really going to accept what we want to accept anyway. All right, that's one principle from education. There's a principle in psychology that's the principle of autonomy, which actually I think has a theological connection. Theologically, we believe that human beings out of all creation are the only beings really given full autonomy, that we have been given the chance to choose our way. Okay? And because of that, there's something inherent in us that resists even well-intentioned, beautiful, good things that are given to us when the force is a little bit too much. When somebody starts to invade in our space, we kind of have this pushback reaction. And so I think both of those, although they're secular concepts, I think they both argue for the fact of not trying to convince someone is sometimes the best way to give them a gift, because what you're saying is, I have something good I want to share. My motivation is good. I think you need it, but I love you enough to say I'm not going to make you. Just handing it over.
Ben and David and Matt and John, we have all these people who want to talk, and we also have a question that I want to hear. Once everyone gets up here, you're going to end up all getting pitched this question we got that came in through the Q&A.
All right, David, you want to go, or should I take it from here?
Go, Ben. You got it.
Okay. I am. Maybe it's just a little bit of the contrarian in me, but I do think that there is importance in trying to convince people. I mean, whenever you look specifically at Sunday of Orthodoxy was just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, that was, it commemorates to a certain extent like a council, and inside of those councils that are such huge pillars of our faith. I mean, there are 2 sides going back and forth at each other, trying to convince each other. I guess I don't see the whole like, no, like don't try and convince people of things. Like I think in certain instances, like it's such a very important thing. And I mean, like, yeah, I mean, if some of the main pillars of our faith, like how we, decide like what is Orthodox, like how we kind of determine like the direction that our faith should take, like councils and different things like that. Like it is, two, not, I don't want to say sides, but I mean kind of sides, just kind of going back and forth, trying to convince each other, like, no, this is the truth. And I think I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth and say that, oh, there's no circumstance where we should try and convince, but, I think certainly within our tradition, like there is, decent precedent for saying, trying to convince people is important.
Well, let me ask you, Ben, because I think it's an interesting point. What would those councils sound like to you if they weren't trying to convince each other? What do you think they would be saying differently than what they said?
I mean, I think they just sort of end up talking around each other and not really getting anywhere.
What do you mean?
So let's say specifically, let's talk about Arianism. Like if they're not trying to convince, oh, this is a good thing or this is a bad thing, I think then you try and come to like this weird, oh, we'll take a little bit from here and we'll take a little bit from there, and then we'll just try and make some like weird mesh because we don't really want to like get down to the details and try and convince each other one way or another.
That's kind of what I thought. And here's what I was thinking about that. I think we can hear not convincing as not presenting, or not powerfully presenting, or not confidently presenting. But I think this is the difference, is do you have to have as your goal changing someone's mind? Or can you say, I'm going to present the truth as best as I can present it, as full as I can, but give someone the chance to accept it or not?
I think in certain instances, like trying to change someone's mind is a noble goal. Like, so there's something that I'm involved in Austin called 40 Days for Life, where we try and set up resources for people that are going to Planned Parenthood clinics and say that, oh, we have, cheaper resources here where, you can get access to different things. And, if you're struggling financially and that's why you want to go to Planned Parenthood, like we have financial resources for you. In that instance where, it could very well be a human life at stake, like I think there is, good moral value in trying to convince someone with the intent of trying to change their mind. Now, certainly that's not every instance, but I do think that there's certainly room for that.
So let's talk about effectiveness. What do you think are, and I think it's a great issue, the right to life cause, because I believe in the cause. What do you think is the most effective thing that movement has done and the least effective thing? I'm not saying righteous in terms of valuable, but in terms of effectiveness. What's worked and what hasn't?
So, I mean, I think obviously what hasn't worked is just like online mudslinging back and forth. And I know, at least right now, one thing that has worked is, being there for people like at those clinics. Like, I don't know how national it is, but there's, from basically like business hours, 7 days a week, there's like prayer vigils and stuff, outside of Planned Parenthood and just different clinics. And it's, there is an element of, hey, we have these resources, and also just engaging in conversation, like, oh, hey, this is a human life, and, this and that. So, I mean, I think there's, the more personal you can be and the more you're able to build relationships, I think that's more effective. But I think even in that, there is an element certainly of trying to convince someone.
All right, Matt has something to add to this point, so we're gonna let him unmute.
So, Father Michael, I'm starting to see this duality that we see in Orthodoxy a lot. There's this, don't try to convince anything or anyone of anything, yet we have Saint Justin Martyr, who was like the father of Christian apologetics. And he's writing in defense, attempting to convince the Roman Empire that the Christians aren't lawless, that they're not bad Roman citizens, that they are good Roman citizens, and everything's, honky-dory there, and that the Roman Empire should really only punish the Christians for the things they do that are actually wrong. And they're not atheists, right? Because they were accused of being atheists for worshiping this new god. But again, we have this very strong message in Christ's life where he doesn't try to convince anyone of anything, but then in like 100 AD circa there, we have someone who just hammers out the apologetics, and he goes crazy with this. So this is kind of where Ben's point there, I was kind of hitting that rock where it's like, okay, well, he brings up one, and there's countless other examples of people having this difficulty balancing this specific maxim. And so given that this is not maybe a one-off scenario, how might we be able to understand this through the lens of a very early patristic?
Yeah, and I think the question is, what does it mean to convince someone? All right, just think it in general. And I think what Father Hopko's saying, and I would agree with him, if convincing is sharing something valuable, doing it in the best way you can, and giving someone the best reason, even the best argument, and letting them choose it, then to me that's okay. We're not talking about convincing in the sense of don't argue for things, don't powerfully defend, don't present. I mean, of anybody who's brought orthodoxy to the modern world, Father Hopko is one of those who did it more than many. And in his older years, adopted podcasting. Not a lot of people his age would spend the time. And then because he saw so many folks losing their faith over this issue of evolution, started out, I think it was supposed to be a 12-part series. It's like 60-some lectures on the faith and science. So he's not one that's not against arguing or working to bring truth. What is he saying? I think what he is saying is as soon as we step over into my job is to do something for you that God gave you the choice and the option to do, which is think for yourself. And that's where I think convincing can be a tough word to understand. If you're hearing it as arguing, presenting powerfully, that's not what we're talking about. It is that line, though, of my job now is to step in and do work that's for you. And I think if you think about it, somebody made the comment earlier, I don't know if it's on here now, is why do we as Orthodox Christians react sometimes very viscerally when we see some very well-intentioned Protestant evangelistic efforts? And one of the reasons why I know it bothers me is I see them overstepping their faith. I'm overstepping their bounds to the other person's faith. When I was on campus, there was a guy that he was on the library steps at University of California, Irvine. And every lunch hour, he would be just there, in his words, preaching the truth and telling everyone else what they were doing wrong and where they were going. So I think don't misunderstand when we use the word convince to say that we don't care about it, we're not going to share it. It's the idea of convincing as now I'm going to overstep and try to do something for someone else that they can really only do for themselves. And I think in terms of effectiveness, when I asked Ben about the whole Right to Life movement, I think the least effective thing that movement and every movement has done is when they try to convince others versus putting out the truth and building a relationship. And a relationship demands loving respect of the other, even when we disagree.
Yeah. I think let's hear from David, then John, and Maria, and keep the conversation going. This is fun.
Unmute David.
There you go.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to think about it because, I was referring to this idea about convincing others. I used to be, I became pro-life because somebody convinced me about the pro-life efforts. I mean, I can see what Ben is going on with that idea. But the problem is that not everybody works that way. I used to believe that, hey, if I present the truth in this manner, I will be able to convince people like to accept it. I mean, in my mind, it will make sense. But
say that again.
I say that sometimes I try to convince people either by them becoming pro-lifer or Orthodox Christians. I used to think that I just have to present like a logical argument or making a way that it will make sense for them to accept it. But sometimes I realized that it just didn't work. So, I mean, even if you present something in the clearest way, some people just won't even care because they have some other ideas in their own mind that it will be difficult to remove. I mean, not everybody wants to give out in something that they believe because that will represent a change. So I will say that that's something that not everybody is going to be able to do. Trying to convince others by being like insistent can also, I don't know, show kind of an idea of you be like really anxious about it. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, and it's a great point. And I think the reason why I'm glad that we picked this topic to talk about is I think a lot of us do a lot of really, well, we want to do a good thing. We have a good motivation. It's a good thing. We're trying to meet a need. I think the tragedy would be if we overstep our bounds. Let's say with the gospel, the Orthodox Christian gospel. And instead of lovingly presenting, I'm not saying we don't talk, we talk beautifully, we talk with great power. But when you try to convince, and by convincing, I'm defining it as, I want to change the other person's mind. I think we're in danger of the person rejecting not our method, rejecting the message because we chose a method that, in my view, tramples over their God-given right to make up their mind. So that's why we got to be careful again. We may convince.
Next up is John and Maria. Yeah.
Hey guys. Hey Father, I really liked your point about autonomy. I think it's awful when people are pressured into doing things that they don't want to do. And even though it's someone pressuring, hey, you should be more Orthodox, go to church more, pressure. That's not their own will though. I think Socrates and Plato talk about this too, about cultivating your free will and cultivating individuality. Yeah, we'll make bad decisions in our life, but through those bad experiences, we realize, oh shoot, what am I doing? Right? This is the truth. I think this is the path, kind of like the prodigal son, right? He thought, I'm going to Vegas, I'll make a lot of money. That's the life I want to live. And then he realized, whoa, this is not truth. This is not joy. And he went right back to the Father. So I really love that point you made about autonomy.
Thank you.
Well, I was thinking about the language of it. So convince, I think what he's trying to say is the negative connotation of convince as opposed to defend. So would it be right to say that we're supposed to defend orthodoxy?
Well, I think you can even present. I don't think it has to be just reactive. We were told to preach the gospel of creation. So I think it can be presenting. Okay. I think the difference is...
It can also be if you were to do offensive and defensive as Christians in our apostolic presentation of the gospel.
Yeah, I think we speak. I think we speak beautifully and powerfully. I think we listen. I love the point of that whole listening part. But I think especially when you look at what Jesus does, and even what the apostles, you could say, okay, was Paul trying to convince the Athenians on Mars Hill? He gave a great argument. Okay? So we're not even saying don't make a good argument. Justin, a lot of make great arguments. We're not saying don't make a good argument presentation. I think the idea, again, I'm going to define it as convincing is when I step over the line of saying it's my job to have someone else change their mind. Somebody said earlier, I think it was David, said, well, I was convinced. And I would challenge him and challenge everyone to say, if you are ever convinced of anything, again, if you slow down that process, what I think you're going to find out is somebody made a convincing argument and you chose to take it, versus somebody who tried to convince you and push and push and push to go over your boundary. And that would often would cause some people to reject and step back because, in my view, it's not respectful. You don't get to take away their freedom that God gave them.
Lazi, and then James.
All right, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, I mean, I think, like, we had the two examples that were brought up earlier of the ecumenical councils, and particularly Arius and of Justin Martyr, as being sort of two apologetical forces in Orthodoxy. But I think there's like an important distinction between the two that's kind of being brought up here, that, you know, with Justin Martyr, right, he's making these points and he's writing these very eloquent arguments, but he's not necessarily going up to a pagan Roman and forcing his head into the book and saying, read every single word of this and behold this argument, you have to read this book. But likewise, and if you go to the ecumenical councils, we recognize them as being ecumenical because they're true. But on a similar note, they were also very, let's say, politically more to be desired, right? Like the famous example of Saint Nicholas slapping Arius is a common one. So in that sense, you can see that sort of negative aspect of the argument taking over in the ecumenical councils a little bit.
Good point, Liza. Thank you.
James is next. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So great points, Father. I come from an advertising background, so I was thinking in that context, like, what do the best advertisements do? And a lot of times they're to make you imagine a life that you don't have, the one that you want. And Christianity offers that, the life that we all want eventually, you know, and the path to get it. And we need to, we are the advertisement of Christianity to everybody else. And so in that way, we need to be living the way that that we've been asked to completely, and without the ulterior motives. And through that, people see that. And that's the best way to convince, through our own actions.
That's a great point, James. And I think, you know, if you look at it from an advertising point of view, again, it's secular, but you can see how people work. And not that we're going to adopt a secular view because it's effective. I'm not arguing for that.
No.
But I'm saying even advertising as a field understands what we would say theologically, and that is that people have been made free. And whether they even know that, the advertisers know it. So the advertiser is not going to hit you over the head. In fact, you probably think about it like when somebody tries to, we don't react well to it. And I think we understand that someone's pushing too hard. Again, doesn't mean the power of the argument. It means that my autonomy, my individuality, my free will is being challenged. And this is where, again, I'm glad they picked this topic, because especially in OCF, and I've been so blessed to see the growth of OCF over these last 10, 20 years. You all are reading about things, you're thinking about it deeply, and you are a wonderful opportunity to spread this beautiful, complete, fully true faith of ours. But I'll say this as a warning. Some people, I'm not saying you, anybody here on here tonight, but some people, and all of us, I would include myself, are tempted, again, with a good message, with a good motivation of caring for somebody, with something they need, and then all of a sudden we do something that's not good, which is to take that freedom from someone and say, because all is good, I know better than you. And in doing that, that's why I'm afraid that they will reject not just the messenger, but the message.
Patrick and then Julian.
Okay, so I took this Maxim, which was Don't try to convince anyone of anything. I'm guilty of this. Like, I have friends who obviously aren't Orthodox. A good friend of mine's a Seventh-day Adventist. And we've gotten to, whatever arguments, and that's not really productive. It's also a bit hypocritical. I kind of associate it with the Pharisee, because I also used to not identify as Orthodox, right? When I was in high school, I was going through whatever struggles, and I identified as an atheist at the time. My parents obviously disagree with that, but they did not try to convince me of stuff. Say, if I was sleeping in on Sunday, they'd go to liturgy, whatever, but they, whatever, prayed for me, all that stuff. But they did not try to convince me, sit down, intervention style, because it was just an unproductive conversation, kind of what you were talking about earlier with the current political climate. They didn't really, what fruit would have come from that conversation at a certain point. That's how I took that, because we all have free will. You can't really force people into a box.
Yeah, given by God.
Julian, what else did you want to add?
Yeah, it's only one thing. As an example, I think when parents actually for their children to do something or anything like that, they are limiting their, they are putting some limitations and boundaries of their learning experiences. So it's the same issue, I think, here. Let's say we're all the children of God, and if we are putting boundaries for each other while we're learning, it will be like also a big challenge for us and for the people that we are trying to convincing them with our point of view, because each one of us is learning in his own way, and like, let's say he's responsible of his own past before being responsible of others' past as well. This is my insight here only.
Yeah, beautiful, Julian. Thank you.
We had a question or two come in, and I think also one person who's trying to join us here. Sophia asked, is it actually dangerous for a person's soul if you tell them a lot about the faith, but then they choose something else?
Well, I think we have to be careful. I think, again, if love is going to be the measurement, love considers other persons. So you're not going to just bombard them. In fact, one of the things I was going to talk about here are some of the ways we think we're not convincing, but we often are. And one of them is burying someone in information. Sometimes out of love, we want to give them all these reasons, and we bury them when they're really not ready. And sometimes we don't know. So I think we have to do the best we can. We're not going to always know it. We're not going to always hit it right, but we'll hit a lot closer when we're trying to say, what's the appropriate amount that this person wants? And I'll tell you one thing none of us do enough is ask. Do you want to hear more? I've got more I can tell you. Do you want to hear more? If they do, they will. If they don't, they'll say, well, no, that's enough. Great. But good thing for us to ask before we just keep trying to bombard them with more and more and more arguments and reasons.
Yeah, so
go ahead, Andrew.
There was another question that came in the comments, and we actually had a discussion in our OCF chapter about this, so I'd really be interested to hear what you have to say. But Valentine said, my background is science, and for us, we need to come to a common opinion if we want to move forward. Is this not convincing? Like, how do we go about that from an academic perspective?
Academics is really interesting when it's done well, because academics says, I'm going to present the facts. Okay? And that's a good example of what I think we're talking about is we're not presenting facts in so much as we're presenting faith. We're presenting a person. We're presenting ideas. We're presenting a way of life, a worldview. So it's not the same in terms of the content, but I think the process says, I'm going to give you the best, but I'm going to offer it to you. I'm not going to shove it down your throat. And I know that shoving down the throat is an extreme example for it might, so just because you're trying to change someone's mind, are you shoving down the throat? Not necessarily, but you start to. Because think about that image of shoving something down their throat. It's our job to take and eat something or open and receive it. But to have it forced down us, that's the idea. I think Father Hopko was trying to say is when we start to convince, we're now pushing past the bounds of offering in love that they either take or don't take. And again, the cross. Christ on the cross is a perfect example. It was the most beautiful, loud, powerful statement anyone has or will ever make in terms of their expression of love. And he offered it, and he offered it in such a silent way that most of the world had said, no, thank you. And if you think about evangelism efforts, modern or ancient, not in Orthodoxy necessarily, but we didn't, as Christians as a whole, as a general, we didn't do well when we overstepped that bound. I think Orthodox evangelism, when done right, never oversteps that. So think about it. Orthodox evangelists, historically, more often than not, were monastics or people coming to share the life of the faith that they offer to those around them. We do have evangelists, but again, you look at the examples, they weren't there arguing and back and forth and saying, no, they offered it and they said, this is what we have to offer you. Powerfully, beautifully, but not forcefully.
Yeah, Ben asked, he's still confused a little bit about the line between like convincing, like this negative convincing we're talking about, and an appropriate defense of our faith. Are we not allowed to make a response if someone?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
But where it's welcomed.
Mm-hmm.
I think when it's not welcome, when people don't really want to hear it, but we keep talking, I think we spoil the message.
That's like Christ silent before Pilate. That's like the example
Exactly.
you're giving. Even when Pilate is pushing for an answer, Christ knows it won't be well received, so he keeps silent.
Right. Yep. And we do have examples of very powerful statements that different saints made. And they were powerful and they had great effect. But again, more often than not, the real effect, the growth in the church, really, I've been thinking about this. Somebody else said it. I heard it in a sermon last week. Two influences that caused the growth of the church. One was the presence and the witness of the martyrs. And two, ironically, the response of the Christians during time of plague, which I said we're going to bring about, but it's towards the end anyway. So, and both of those were about, I'm not forcing. In fact, I'm receiving pain and suffering because I'm not going to force you. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to fight you. You want to kill me? Kill me. It's what I believe. It's up to you if you want. And that witness is what, we believe grew the church more than anything.
Yeah. I think something that's personally helpful for me is to think about, are you pursuing a person with your ideas, your opinions, your beliefs, or are you pursuing a person with Christ's love too? Because I think that it'll help you discern too, when is the right time to speak and when is it the right time to say, you know what, I've now stepped outside of the tradition of the gospel, which is the tradition of love. And maybe if you start putting yourself, not so much a don't do this, because sometimes it's helpful for us to have a yes, do this, is to say, I will pursue people with love. And if I put that first, I'll know when I'm defending the faith, when I'm giving an account for the hope within me, and when I'm just trying to convince someone of something to get them on my side.
Yeah. I wanted to share something. I'll share it now. I really tried to find anything that Father Hopko written that expounded upon this, and all I could find was a recording of him talking about it. And I'll read just part of what it says is, it can't be my desire to convince you and to win in an argument. I can only, to use a scriptural word, bear witness or make testimony. But I can't have as my goal to convert the other. And that's even true with evangelization. We're not out there to convert people. We're out there to bring them the joy of the victory of God in Christ. What they do with it is between them and God. And again, do we want them converted? Of course we do. But it also means that in humility, it's not our job. And I would even say in our arrogance, when we try to, we weaken the witness. So I think he says it beautifully. It's not about not presenting truth in its fullness, of its beauty, of its power. It's just, I think, and I'll sum it up my talk with this, I think what it is, it's saying let's use as our process what we're talking about with the content. If we're going to preach in our content a loving Christ who offers himself freely and lovingly and not forcefully, because he never does, then the delivery needs to match that. Or else if it doesn't, then we're spoiling the content of it. So anyway, I hope this was helpful to everybody. I think we invoked some good discussion. Hopefully we didn't confuse anybody or upset anybody. But it's good to think about, because I think our witness to the world is important now and really at any time.
This was such a fun adventure. I'm really excited to do this again. It was so lovely to see some faces that I recognize and some new ones who were out there. We're going to close with prayer with Father Michael. And then if you have a question you want to stick around for, or something you want to talk about, Andrew and Father Michael and I will stay for 15 more minutes. Let's go. Prayer.
All right. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Oh, Christ, our God, we thank you for loving us. We thank you for the gift of time together. At this time of great need around the world, we ask for your loving presence to be known, as it always is for those who seek it. Encourage us and strengthen us to be your witness in this world at this time, and enlighten us to be good witnesses of your love. You freely gave yourself to the world. Encourage us and strengthen us to freely give ourselves to bring your light and your life to the world. You're the Holy One, and you give all glory, honor, and worship to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and to the ages of ages. Amen.
Amen. All right, this is wonderful. Like I said, we'll stay for a few more minutes. If you want to raise your hand again to add a final thought or ask Father Michael a question, we are here.
Yeah, it could be on this topic or any topic. So.
Or to just say hi.
Yeah.
Marcus.
Nathan, how many people were on? I'm curious. How many were on? Nathan asked.
We fluctuated somewhere between 84 and 101.
Wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
104.
I'm working on making Zoom promote people. It's a little slow today in terms of getting people on the screen.
Okay.
Marcus has returned.
Hey, Andrew. Father, I wanted to ask about Father Maxim's, Father Hopko's, Father Hopko's Maxim number 47 in conjunction with 43, which is give advice only when asked or when it is your duty. And I wanted to know if you could say something about how, oh dear.
But
about, I hope my internet's okay. Basically, in conjunction between 47 and 43, how we can tell when it is, in fact, our duty to give advice, and what advice means in that context. Because I know before you were using...
Read the Maxim again.
The one that's about...
Give advice only when asked or when...
Yeah, so think about that. Advice is what somebody, when they want it, will be open to. And the idea of offering it when it's not asked, I'll tell you my experience is when it's not asked, people will at best politely listen to me. And I can tell you after, I've been a priest almost 25 years now, the longer I've been a priest, the more I've realized that the more forceful I am in either offering advice or trying to convince, because I'm as guilty as anybody, it doesn't work. So I think the example of Christ is always paramount for us. The example of martyrs is paramount. And, you know, St. Peter says, be ready to give account for the hope that's within you. We should be ready. But we should be a little slow to bring that out, especially in terms of words and advice.
I have some pretty strict rules about that, if you're curious.
Yes.
I tell people often, unless you're asked, that's the first one. And when the way I've interpreted it's your duty is your person's parent, you're their spiritual father, or you have some kind of, you've been put in some kind of role of authority in their life where it's appropriate for you to give unasked for advice. Otherwise, it's probably not your job in this moment to tell them what you think of what they should do. And I don't always follow that, but I try to.
Yeah. I mean, there's two arguments. There's, is it helpful and is it effective? And I can tell you, generally, if people aren't asking you for your advice, it's not going to be helpful because it's not effective. They don't want it. They want it to last.
I have a question. If we are being attacked about our faith, should we say nothing if we know this person is truly unreceptive, or should we say something like how should we respond?
It's a great question. Actually, I was going to say it, and I didn't say it in the last answer, but if you look at how Jesus taught, he asked a whole lot more questions than we imagine. So go back some time, and you've got some time now in your hands. Go back and look at how Jesus dialogued. He dialogued so often with questions. And I think that's a good thing for us. In other words, let's say you have some advice. You want to share it with somebody. Ask them, hey, I got some ideas. You want to hear it? If they say yes, okay. If they say no, in the case where they're being argumentative and you think all they want to do is argue, I think that's where sometimes a more powerful statement is, I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to try to convince you. But if you want to know what I think, I'm happy to share. And it really puts them on the spot of admitting either they don't want to hear you, or now if they're going to dialogue, they got to hear you because you gave them the option. So I think asking questions more often, and when a great question is, well, you know, do you want to hear? Or another question is, how much do you want to hear? When people say, what's Orthodox Christianity? I'm tempted to give them the 1 hour intro 101 first lesson. But I always say, you want the 10-second version, you want the 5-minute version, you want the hour version. And they tell me very clearly, they're like, I want the 5-minute, I want the 10-second. Mm-hmm. I've never had anybody tell me they want the 1 hour.
Caroline has a question.
Hello.
Whoever Caroline's computer is.
Big fan of this panel right here. I'll tell you that. But wait, where's that? So I'm watching this with my family. They refuse to be on camera. But what was the thing you said about? It was about, what was it?
Just read the question.
Oh, I don't have it up. Anyways, it was like Jesus.
No, Christ basically put out the word, and he didn't try to convince anyone. What he said was, those who have ears, let them hear.
Beautiful.
That boils it down to what its essence is right there.
There you go. Beautiful.
Really, really good thought, Caroline. I know. I'm just.
Thank you. Thank you. I love to have people speak for me. It's very, very
I also like that you guys spelled your last name wrong. That's my favorite part.
Thank you. That's Caroline.
Catherine and Andreas.
Oh yes, but yeah.
I wonder when we're able to come over and play foosball together.
Catherine, go ahead. Did you have a question or something you want to add?
So, Father, wait. Can you comment on that?
show you.
What was that?
I don't know. I'm muting their household. I'm going to let Catherine have a turn.
I don't mind. It's not.
Oh, I was muted.
What the question was, but
He said that he wanted to hear what your opinion was on that, Father.
Oh.
On which one? Which part? Oh, here's the ear. Let him hear.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Christ
yeah.
not trying to convince anyone, putting the word out and letting them make the decision.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and let him hear. It's like, hey, you want to hear it? You've got ears. You hear it. He didn't sit there and pound anybody. Again, just look at how he interacted. Lots of questions, a lot of silence, a lot of think about a parable. I didn't go into it in depth, but a parable, the person either is going to go, oh, nice story, and go on their way, or they're invited to go, what does that mean? Or they might even ask, like the disciple did, what does that mean? So it invites the deeper knowledge. It doesn't force it to the person to go, I don't want to know that. And I think that's why, there's a lot of people that would say you can't prove Christianity. I think the closest thing we have as proof that Christianity is the truth is that if you were going to invent a religion and do it in the most effective way with the most powerful statement, it would be a God who becomes one of us and humbly says, if you want to follow me, follow me. I'm not going to stand over you 100 feet tall and bellow out across the mountains. I'm going to become small, weak. I'm even going to die. And if you want to follow me, follow me. But by the way, if you're going to follow me, you're going to die too. yeah, you're going to rise because I will rise and he rose. But and even that, think about it. The fact that to follow Christ, what does he say? Take up your cross.
Mm-hmm.
What's a cross? A cross is I carry guilt. Even if I don't deserve it, I take it. I don't put it on anybody else.
All right, we've got 4 more minutes, Father. Catherine, Andreas, Thomas.
Okay, I guess that's me. So I want to go back to Father, what you said about just the response. Am I on a projector? The response you had to people who may not want your advice and people who might be a little argumentative in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Where you said that a response to that might be useful to have is, hey, I'm not here to argue with you. Hey, I'm not, I just, I know what I believe. And if you want to hear it, like, I just really appreciated that because I know that when I've been on the more, not necessarily argumentative, but defensive side with my beliefs, when I'm confronted with
the attacked side?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
When I'm confronted with, hey, this wasn't an argument, I'm just sharing X, Y, or Z, it kind of makes me go into my own self and think, oh, maybe that conversation that I was having was not from a place of love. And so I think that response in particular really brings it back to, a discourse that really has its roots in love and in truth.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it always depends on us being more humble, not less powerful. The dichotomy is not humility and power. I think the dichotomy is what looks like power, which would be what I would call, to use Father Hopko's word, convincing, to try to overpower the other person's false idea, versus what I think Christ proved to us, which is what is real power? It's humility. And he wasn't the only one to do it. You look at the work of Gandhi or Martin Luther King. I mean, they learned that real power, if it's going to be powerful and effective, has to be built on weakness and vulnerability. So yeah, I think that sounds like what you're experiencing when you're in that kind of a conversation.
Yeah, most definitely.
Andreas and then Thomas, and then we're gonna all go get some rest tonight, guys.
Okay, hello. I'll try to keep it short, but my question is, so Christina a little earlier made a point about how, in front of Pontius Pilate, Jesus was quiet because he knew that what he would say would probably not be well received. And I was kind of wondering how the whole discussion we've had tonight, and especially that point by Christina, goes with kind of our call as Orthodox Christians to acknowledge and confess Christ. We know that he said, whoever acknowledged me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father. So how does that go with our call to acknowledge him, even when it will not be well received, or it might not be safe to do so, like so many martyrs have done?
It's a great question. And you think about the terminology, to confess Christ. This is another way of looking at the issue. Does confessing Christ mean we are out there trying to change someone else's mind? That's one possibility. Or the other possibility, what is a confessor in the Orthodox Church? Not the person who hears your confession. Like St. Maximus the Confessor. What does it mean to be a confessor in the church? Anybody know? What's
act
that?
out. Kind of just a guess, like to act out the teachings of the church.
Yeah, but in a very specific way. So the martyrs are those who died for the faith. If you suffered for the faith, but it didn't lead to your death, you're called a confessor. So Lazzy answered it, to suffer for the faith. So that's the sense I think we are most called to confess Christ, to suffer. Part of our suffering is, I want to convince you, again, with my good motivation, with a good message, and you need it. I'm going to suffer by not overpowering you, because I have to with my message of Christian love, I've got to deliver it in Christian love, which means I got to suffer in the sense of it's not about me. Not me convincing you, not me changing your mind. It's about me offering it to you as a gift, knowing that you're going to have to either take it on your own or reject it on your own. I'm going to do my job to present it as powerfully as I can, but I think a lot of that power that we often try to deny is the power of humility. To confess Christ in that suffering way of I'm not going to overpower you. I'm not better than you.
Right. And even Jesus says, it is as you say, when you know, his accusers say, are you the king of the Jews? And he says, it is as you say. He doesn't deny who he is. So I think there's a difference between, again, trying to convince or and denying Christ. Like the verse you quoted, Andreas, about like confessing Christ or denying him. I think there's a way to confess Christ in this way Father Michael's talking about, to suffer for him, that doesn't use any words, that is silent. That's even, you know, but it's in opposition to denying Christ, not being silent. Thomas, close us out with some great thought. Oh, we can't hear you, friend.
I think I know Thomas.
Now we can hear you.
Oh, good.
I know Thomas. You're not 12 anymore, though.
No, I'm not.
Good to see you, my friend.
You as well. Thank you, Father. I had a question about how, if you had any advice, how to approach a situation where someone is trying to convince people of Orthodox Christianity, especially someone that is seen as representing the church.
Great question. And I think the answer is the same, only now instead of talking about how we act when trying to convince someone of the faith that's, let's say, outside the faith, it's the same thing within. And I think we do it the same way. We ask questions. We invite dialogue. We invite someone if they want to hear and to hear an opinion. But if we do what they're doing, it's not going to be any more effective than what they're doing, because it's the same method, and a bad method doesn't have good effect. So I think it's the same thing, is in our own humility to say or to ask, hey, do you think it might be this? Or have you thought about this? Or do you want to talk about it because it might be this? Again, you're not going to lie to them. You might be even to say, I'm wondering if this might be the reality. But you're not saying, hey, stop it because you're wrong, and you're not going to, again, try to overstep their freedom. It's a great question.
That's awesome. You guys, thanks for sticking around. I think I'm going to say goodnight to you all. I appreciate you all being here, and I hope you guys come next week to talk to Steve Christoforou on the next Maxim, and I hope you have a lot to think about and try to live out this week. Thank you so much, Father Michael. This was
Thank you all. This was
amazing.
great. A lot of fun.
This was so great. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.